Trump's attorney general faced tough questions on Capitol Hill today. Jeff Sessions was grilled by the Senate Intelligence Committee about his role in the firing of James Comey. Comey's testimony last week and Sessions' own meetings with the Russian ambassador, meetings he didn't initially even admit. Well, Sessions' testimony comes nearly a week after Comey testified that the president spread lies about his firing and questioned the attorney general's role in his dismissal. Well, President Trump has said the FBI was in virtual turmoil under Comey's leadership. Well, today, Sessions, the attorney general, said he never discussed performance concerns with Comey before his firing. Let's watch him on that.
The fact that you'd worked with Director Comey for some time, did you ever have a conversation as a superior of Director Comey with his failure to perform or some of these accusations that he wasn't running the FBI in a good way or that somehow the FBI is in turmoil? Did you have any conversations with Director Comey about those subjects?
I did not.
Well, Sessions also addressed Comey's testimony last week about his private meeting in the Oval Office with the president. Comey said he confronted Sessions and told him that he could never happen again. That could never happen again. Here was Sessions, however, today.
Would it be fair to say that you felt like perhaps you needed to stay because it involved the FBI director?
Well, I don't know how I would characterize that, Senator Rubio. I left. It didn't seem to me to be a major problem. I knew that Director Comey, longtime experience in the Department of Justice, could handle himself well.
Well, in another stunning moment, Sessions said he never received a classified briefing about the Russian election meddling itself.
Do you believe the Russians interfered with the 2016 elections?
It appears so. The intelligence community seems to be united in that. But I have to tell you, Senator King, I know nothing but what I've read in the paper. I've never received any detailed briefing on how hacking occurred or how information was alleged to have influenced the campaign.
You received no briefing on the Russian active measures in connection with the 2016 election?
No, I don't believe I ever did.
Well, he could have gotten one if he asked for it. Over headlines, by the way, up from the hearing, Sessions called the suggestion of collusion with Russia a detestable lie. He strongly rejected the argument that his recusal from the Russian investigation meant he should not have been involved in Comey's firing. But Sessions dodged all questions about his interactions with President Trump, even though he said the president hadn't asserted executive privilege. For more, I'm joined by NBC national security reporter Ken Delaney. And you watched the whole hearing today. What grabbed you?
Well, it grabbed me that Jeff Sessions locked in his story under oath that there was no collusion with Russia. So at this point, if anybody says there was, on Jeff Sessions' part, they got to prove it. Secondly, though, he could not deny that he met with the Russian ambassador in the Mayflower Hotel, as we were talking about last night. He said he didn't recall, and he may have had an encounter. He disputed that there was a private meeting. And then I thought one of the biggest revelations of the hearing, though, was when he said he had not been briefed at all about any of the Russia hacking. Now, we understand he's recused from the Russia investigation, but the Attorney General is a member of the National Security Council. The Russian hacking and interference campaign in the election is one of the biggest national security challenges facing this country, and it really raises the question, what is the Trump administration doing about it? Because, James Comey testified that Donald Trump never asked him about it in their 9 encounters. And now we have the Attorney General of the United States saying he's never gotten a single classified briefing about it. And then later in the hearing, he acknowledged that we really don't have a good strategy for counteracting Russian hacking or other cyber attacks. And so, I think more questions need to be asked of this administration about what exactly they are doing to prevent the next hack.
Yeah,
in
they are the
2018,
president.
Chris.
He is the president of the United States. He ought to be looking out for us, and what the Russians are up to should be pretty much at the top. They and the North Koreans, what they're up to should matter the most. Thank you, NBC's Ken Delaney. I'm joined now by Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. He was in the hearing today. Senator, I was stunned. Well, I can't say stunned anymore, but what did you make of the fact that it didn't seem to bother the Attorney General that he was whisked out of the room in the Oval Office, gotten cleared to the room so that the president can have a private tete-a-tete with the FBI director? Why would he want to talk to the FBI director except about something to do with the FBI? I mean, they weren't planning the kids' school picnics. I mean, it is by nature something to do with the job of FBI director.
And I don't think we ever got a good answer for that, but we didn't get a good answer for a number of things. I think we saw a pattern today of this Attorney General refusing to answer very basic questions in front of this committee, and they chose to stonewall and obstruct this investigation.
What do you make of the fact that Sessions seemed to have no problem with firing Comey, even though the president said he fired Comey because of the Russian investigation, and Sessions was recused from having anything to do with the Russian investigation. Well, how about getting rid of the guy prosecuting it? That had something to do with it. I don't know how he's recusing himself if he's firing Comey, the guy investigating the whole Russian matter.
At the very least, he should have realized how improper that looks. There's sort of this parallel universe thing going on here with the Attorney General, with the President as well. And it seems that facts don't matter. The President can say one thing, the Attorney General comes and says something else. The two don't add up together, but that's how this administration seems to roll.
Well, Senator, you're new to the Senate, but what is this new governmental gag rule that people who work for the president must never discuss or don't have to ever discuss conversations with the president ever about anything? All they have to do is say, I don't think that's appropriate. I'm not setting executive privilege. I just don't want to do it, and I'm not going to do it. It looks like they're all singing that song now.
Absolutely, and I think it's so far it's been an effective way of stonewalling the committee. I asked some pretty silly questions because I am new and I'm not an attorney. I said, what is the legal standard here? And there is no appropriateness legal standard. They seem to have plucked this from thin air, and they're hanging on to it. Now we see this pattern of Director Coates, of the Attorney General, of Admiral Rogers, all using this as an excuse not to answer some very basic yes or no questions.
Well, how's the special counsel, Mr. Mueller, how's he going to investigate this whole question of collusion, if it happened, if he can't get anybody to talk to him?
Well,
under oath.
I don't know.
Mean, is anybody in the administration going to participate in this investigation, or are they all going to stonewall, to use your word?
I can't speak for the special counsel, but I think from what I understand, a special counsel has some tools that are not at our disposal to get to the bottom of this, and I think we will just have to watch and see that play out.
Well, maybe it's a cattle prod. Thank you very much, Senator Martin Heinrich of New Mexico. I'm joined right now by U.S. Congresswoman Jackie Speier of California. She's, of course, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, and also joining me is the Washington Post's Philip Bump. Jeff Sessions today refused to say whether Comey's handling of the Russia investigation had anything to do with his firing. Believe it or not, he did. Let's watch.
So do you concur with the president that he was going to fire Comey regardless of recommendation because the problem was the Russian investigation?
Senator Feinstein, I guess I'll just have to let his words speak for himself. I'm not sure what was in his mind explicitly when we talked with him.
Did you ever discuss Director Comey's FBI handling of the Russia investigations with the president or anyone else?
Senator Feinstein, that would call for a communication between the Attorney General and the President, and I'm not able to comment on that.
You are not able to answer the question here, whether you ever discussed that with him?
That's correct.
Let me go to Jackie Speier. Congresswoman, thank you for joining us. Do you think he has an inability to remember anything? I mean, I'm serious. I mean, he 3 times met with the Russian ambassador, apparently, or at least he won't deny it, and now he can't remember any of those meetings. I mean, I don't know how many times. I think if I met with the Russian ambassador, I'd remember it, especially this guy, Kislyak. He looks like a character out of Dr. Strangelove. I mean, he really does look like the Russian ambassador, okay? So I don't understand how, and the accent certainly would give him away. Why do you think he keeps forgetting these meetings? It seems to be very convenient to keep forgetting all questionable meetings. All of them, every one.
He has a serious amnesia problem. There's no question about it.
Well, maybe it's benefit for him. He's not responsible for any meeting because he can't remember any. You know, ignorance is bliss with this character. Your thoughts?
What's really troubling about this is that, you know, their paychecks are paid for by the American taxpayers, not by Donald Trump. And yet, right now, all they're doing is protecting the president at the expense of the American people. What's interesting about Sessions, when he was a U.S. Senator, he was all over Russia. He talked about how Russia had to feel pain after they invaded Ukraine, and that in the Crimea there was a spilled bottle of milk that couldn't be put back together. So he's totally flipped on Russia now as part of the Trump universe. And yeah. I think what we've seen here is that until it goes to the courts, frankly, until it's challenged in the courts, we're not going to get the kind of responses from the executive branch, because there is no executive privilege that's been actually invoked here. So to somehow concoct this new form of privilege that doesn't exist really creates an imbalance between the executive branch and Congress.
Hold on, Congressman. Let me get a Philip bump on this. This is a new doctrine.
Right.
Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. I mean, these people have said pretty confidently they don't have to answer any questions that have to do with their relationship with President Trump. That's off base.
Yeah, I mean, the argument, essentially what they're trying to do is avoid this phrase executive privilege. They're trying not to have to say that
Why
Trump...
does it sound imperious?
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I use for this is that it's as though someone went and said, I'm not going to testify because in the future I might want to invoke the Fifth Amendment against self-incrimination. I'm not doing that now. I'm not invoking the Fifth Amendment now, but in the future I might want to, so I'm not going to testify against myself. That's essentially what they're doing. They're preventing Trump from having to say that he's invoking executive privilege, which I think they think will be viewed by the American people as suggesting that he's culpable in some way. But I also understand that there is probably a likelihood that these people that are going to speak about conversations with Donald Trump, that may be countermanded by what Donald Trump himself says. I mean, how Donald Trump may eventually portray these conversations may not line up with what they're saying.
Congresswoman, do you think these guys, and most of them are guys, they're men, are afraid of Trump? I have never seen such fealty, such obedience. They're afraid to speak out of school. They're afraid to do anything but give these hosannas, these almost religious praises to the president when they're in his company. It is pretty powerful stuff. People like Sean Speier look scared to death. I don't know, what is it? Do you feel that when you're near Trump, this intimidation power he seems to have over his people?
Well, I thankfully haven't spent much time with the president, but I would say for those that are in his orbit, they're all interested in keeping their jobs and probably their reputations. And so right now, the better part of valor is to just kind of go with the program. And there's a script that's being played out. That cabinet meeting was I mean, it was really very difficult to watch.
You and I are of the same religion, I understand. I just want to say I've never heard anybody say it was a blessing to serve Donald Trump. I mean, I don't know, that word jumped out at me. That was pretty much of I think an overstatement. But what did you make of that? That's what Reince Priebus said. A blessing.
Yeah, a blessing. Well, I think that he was at a loss for words, and frankly, that's the word that came out. But the president's not God, although he certainly acts like it sometimes.
I think.